what we have is a position on people being out there and casting their ballots. The more people that we have, the more voices that we have, the more engagement that we have. And for us, that's a big deal. So these candidate forums are part of what we intend to do and continue doing to be a benefit to the community at large. If you haven't been to a Delridge District Council meeting before, there's a thing we do. There's some folks from the Delridge Council here tonight, so I'll open it up by welcoming the council. Normally we go around the table and everyone says, "Hi, I'm so-and-so and I do this," and then we go around the council. It's the introduction. There's too many people in here tonight to do introductions of everyone, although that would be super fun for me. But I think we'll just break it up into introductions for Delridge District Council members that are here, the candidates that are here, and everyone else that's here. So, Delridge District Council, welcome to the District Council tonight. Yay! Candidates, welcome to the Delridge District Council meeting. Yay! Everybody else! Yay! That always feels nice. We started doing that kind of spontaneously as just an appreciation of the fact that you came out on a weeknight, you're missing dinner maybe, you're engaged civically. We just think that's so rad. And so that's just one of the ways that we kind of acknowledge the fact that you're here and you're participating. Thank you. Again, we're here at South College. There's some information on the table just outside, directly across from us in the doors. Grab some on the way out. There's a lot of things they're offering and a lot of things they're doing. And the literature they have out there is nice. All right, a little bit about our forum tonight. We have the two candidates for the 34th District, Nguyen and Shannon Braddock. The forum that we're going to do is pretty basic. What we've learned from how we conduct our forums is what we like to do: give the people a chance to speak, present why they're here, why they want your vote, how they want this to go, and just let it out. Not structured, not formatted, just a presentation from them to you. Each of them will have a chance to make that presentation, and then after that we open it up to the floor. We let people just ask their questions directly. We don't want anyone to feel stifled or feel like, I wish they would have asked that question, or this is the thing I really want to know about. We want to avoid that, so we're just going to turn the mics over to you guys. At that point, you can ask a question, ideally an on-topic question, but, that was humor, the response to that question has to be answerable by both candidates. So the question that you have needs to pertain to elected office or what they intend to do as the representative of the 34th District, something along those lines. But both candidates need to be able to answer it, so just keep that in mind when framing your question. The questions will be answered. One of the candidates will go first, the other one will go second. On the next question, it'll just reverse. So nobody's going to go first every time or second every time. That's how we're handling that. Any questions from the candidates? Okay. Any questions from the audience? All right, let's get this started. Who would like to go first? Joe, you were here first. You want to kick it off, or do you want to go second?
Yeah, I'll go first. That's fine.
Rock and roll.
It's like very loud. Thank you so much for coming out, first off, on this lovely day. It's important, like we were saying, to be civically engaged and be informed. So I'm honored to be able to be here to speak on the behalf of the community and be able to meet folks here as well. My name is Joe Nguyen. I was actually born and raised in this area. My family were refugees from Vietnam. So my father fought in the Vietnam War in the Navy and was able to evacuate out here to Seattle. My mom eventually joined him later on. She was in one of the first waves of the boat people who escaped Vietnam by boat and came over here. We were allowed to come here because we had access to public housing. So I was born in White Center, what is now called Ceola Gardens. Back then it was called Park Lake Homes. A few years later, we moved to Burien, where I spent most of my life. During that time, my father was actually in a car accident when I was a young kid. Rendered him quadriplegic, he had brain damage, and because of that, we experienced a healthcare crisis. For years, my brother and I would have to carry my father up and down the front steps of our house to get him to medical appointments. It wasn't until a few years later, one of our neighbors, Mr. Severson, I think he actually still lives in the area, him and his buddies came by and they actually built us a ramp to get my dad up and down the stairs because they saw what we were trying to do. And that's one of the reasons why I'm running today, is because this community came and supported me in our greatest time of need. And I want to be able to give back to the folks who served us as well. And that's also one of the reasons why I care about healthcare for all so much, is we experienced a healthcare crisis through no fault of our own. But because of that, it created a great hardship on us. I was actually a janitor at my high school to help make ends meet. What's interesting is I was student body president at that time as well. So I'd be student body president, and then I'd also sweep the floors in the afternoon. Right, so I was actually student body president at Saddle University as well, which I have some folks who went to Saddle U. I was student body president there, and I would go wash dishes at night to help pay for tuition and whatnot. So I believe that having the lived experiences and the values of the folks who are here for working families is very important to make sure that we have the representation that matters for this community as well. We were very fortunate to be one of 11 folks who ran for office in the primary. And then now we're one of 2 to be able to run for office in the general election as well. So what's interesting is the proudest achievement that I've had in this campaign so far hasn't actually been being able to win the primary. So we ended up winning with over 30% of the vote. The proudest achievement has actually been the fact that I've met with over 12 folks who themselves now are thinking about running for office. They're young people, people of color, different backgrounds. One of the interesting things is winning the Senate seat isn't actually my goal. My goal is to make sure that we have representation in our community that reflects the values of the people here in all levels, so that everybody has a voice and everybody has a chance to succeed. So the fact that we're able to bring in folks who themselves are now interested in running for office is, to me, the main reason why I'm running for office in the first place. We have events where you have folks who this is their first time being civically engaged. This is the first time they've contributed to a campaign. This is the first time that they've been involved in politics. It's because they're just now seeing representation that reflects them. What's interesting is I'm actually the first person of color to win a primary in this district for a state level office in the history of Washington State. If I were to win, I'd be the first person of color to legislate in the House or the Senate in this district in the history of Washington State. And mind you, this includes White Center and Burien as well. So the thing is, when you don't have representation to represent you, it isn't as if the folks at the table don't necessarily care about your issues or your needs. It's that there's a disconnect there, so they don't necessarily know that these are important things. So for instance, I care about healthcare for all. I care about making sure that we have a progressive tax structure so that everybody has a chance to succeed. I also care about fully funding our education to close the opportunity gap. Oftentimes people think that healthcare for all or progressive tax structure is a complicated, tricky thing to do, and politically it's very tough. Well, we've knocked on over about 20,000 doors at this point, and certainly there's a need and a desire and a want to have those things. And the only reason why I believe that it's politically tough is because the folks in leadership are so disconnected from regular people. So my goal is to not just legislate, but is also make sure that we present the values of the folks here. So personally, I actually volunteer a lot in the community. So I am on the board of a nonprofit called Wellspring Family Services. We do a lot of work with family homelessness. We actually passed legislation this past year to help young kids who experience trauma. I also do a lot of work with law enforcement and community relations. About a year ago, there was a young man named Tommy Lay who was shot and killed by law enforcement. And in that aftermath, a few of us came together and put together a forum for law enforcement, for community leaders, and for his family to really help guide that process so that there was a positive dialogue to hopefully make sure that this doesn't happen again. I also volunteer a bit with the Washington Low-Income Housing Association, so working on how do we pass legislation to get more affordable housing in Washington State. But my background is actually in tech. So I'm a senior manager at Microsoft. I work on a team called Worldwide Learning. So really what we do is we build and provide job training resources for free for folks who are interested in tech. So we're acknowledging that there is a very dynamic economy that's happening. Not everybody's being able to get the access that they need to be able to achieve success. And we build free job training resources for folks who are interested in it. So the biggest thing about my life and the goals for me is making sure that we have the opportunity for everybody to succeed, regardless of where you were born, regardless of your income, regardless of where you're from. And the reason why I want to run again is because this community really raised me. This community gave me a voice, and I believe that I'm ready to serve in the Senate is because this community is the one that prepared me. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm looking forward to all the questions, but hopefully that gives you an idea of why we're running for office and why we care and why we're doing it the way that we're doing it as well. To give a little bit of context, I don't know how much time we have. Is it okay still? 3 minutes? Oh wow, talked a lot. Yeah. So the way that we're running our campaign is a little bit unique. We don't take corporate PAC money for a whole host of reasons, but mainly it's because we believe that there should be no ambiguity in terms of our relationship with the community. We're also engaging communities that have largely been ignored from the process. So usually what you do is you try to contact the folks who you know are going to vote, and then you get them out to vote. We do that, but we also have literature in multiple languages. We have a campaign video that has 4 languages, and we door knock the areas that historically have been ignored. So honestly, Delridge, White Center, Burin areas as well. And we don't necessarily have the institutional support as well. But the reason why that's important for us to run a campaign like that is because I want to prove to everybody that you can also run for office even if you don't have all these other things. So despite being out fundraised, you can still win a primary election or a general election. And the whole point of running the way that we're running isn't necessarily because it's the easiest thing to do, it's actually the hardest thing to do. But it's the right thing to do because I want to make sure that everybody here, if you're thinking about running for office, you should be able to do it as well. So hopefully that's under my 3 minutes. Thank you so much again. Appreciate the time. And I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Joe.
All right. Thank you. Can everybody hear me all right? Great. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I really do, and I say this often, this is democracy in action when community really turns out to meet candidates, to hear about issues on the ballot in front of you. So I really appreciate you all taking the time this evening to hear from us and to share with us the issues that are important to you and the questions that you have. So thank you so much. I'm Shannon Braddock, and I am running for the 34th District State Senate seat. I am a single mom who works outside the home. I have 3 kids. My youngest daughter, Caitlin, is 11, and she's adopted from Korea. And last year, she came home from school one day, anxious and upset, and started to cry when she was telling me that she was hearing at school that kids were getting sent back to their birthplaces. And she was worried that that was going to happen with her, that she was going to get sent back to Korea without me with her. So I was able to calm her down and to explain to her why that would not happen to her, but of course I also had to tell her that there are many families in our communities for whom I can't reassure them in that way, that they live in that fear because of what our federal government is doing with our immigrant and refugee communities and with separating families and detaining children. And I talked with her about what it meant to be a welcoming community. I talked with her about some of the work that King County and the City of Seattle is doing to try to demonstrate to her that community is stepping up the best that they can. What I didn't talk to her about, honestly, is the fact that I cried after this conversation thinking about what it means to be a parent and to work to protect your kids and bring them to a place that you feel is going to offer them a better future. And to have that government break the trust and the bond between a parent and a child by separating them and by detaining them, it is unconscionable. And so I think it is more important than ever that in this state and in our communities, we stand up, we find ways to protect immigrants and refugees. The City of Seattle and King County are doing great work partnering to provide resources for legal defense with Northwest Immigrants' Rights Project. We are reaching into communities to try to really have good cultural competency about how to provide safe spaces for people to access public health services. And at the state level, we need to make sure that we are doing that same kind of work and providing those same kind of resources and supports, and to be sure that people know their rights and know, even within the administrations of our state, information that should be released or should not be released to our federal government. So I think it's going to be one of those vital issues that we continue to work on and continue to fight this federal government who is trying to be so divisive and hold back our immigrant and refugee communities. My middle son is now a freshman in high school, and I was pretty distraught one day last year when he told me the most interesting thing he had done in school all day was figure out where to hide or how to escape if an active shooter came to school. And that is not what our educators or our kids should be thinking about when they're spending their days in school. What they should be thinking about is how to thrive and learn and feel safe and comfortable in that space. And this is a place where our legislature has failed. And I will lead on this in the Senate. I am proud to be sole endorsed by the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, to be a Moms Demand Action candidate, and I'm a supporter of Initiative 1639, which is on your ballot. That is a gun responsibility initiative that provides enhanced background checks, raises the purchase age to 21 for assault rifles, requires safe storage, and a variety of other things. I believe that this initiative will pass, but if it does not, in the state Senate, I will be somebody who will lead, who will sponsor, co-sponsor, or support every piece of that initiative to be certain that we are leading, because we shouldn't depend on our kids walking out of our schools to demand action from us. We should be the ones angry enough to take action and to do the right thing and to keep our communities safe. My oldest son is now a freshman in college. He's gay, came out when he was 16, and I was really happy that I live in this community, that he was in a pretty darn safe place to be able to come out and to be welcomed. But this is another place where we're seeing at the federal level and at the state level some assaults on our LGBTQ communities. Hate crimes have gone up. They've gone up even here. This is something we at the state need to be certain that we are keeping track of, that we are providing resources for, and that we are protecting and again providing safe spaces for all of our communities. And I especially, as we're seeing at the federal level and with this particularly now conservative Supreme Court, I am worried that there will be more and more attacks that our state will have to stand up for, or stand up against. And I've always been an ally and advocate to the LGBTQ communities, and as I say now, I'm a mama bear ally and advocate. So I will stand up and I will fight on behalf of the civil rights of our LGBTQ communities, and particularly as we've seen in this state, some assaults on our transgender communities as well. So my kids are really a big motivating factor in why I run, and they've also always been a motivating factor in how I engage with the community. So my first volunteer work, I've been in the 34th district for almost 20 years, and the first volunteer work I engaged in was through the Lafayette PTA as the legislative representative to go to Olympia and advocate on behalf of public education and encourage others to do the same. I've been actively involved as a volunteer and a precinct committee officer with the 34th District Democrats, helping to elect and to support issues that are progressive. And I have also was a volunteer for several years with the West Seattle Food Bank. I served as their board secretary. I helped to manage the strategic plan. And that was a place where I really saw, as the client base was growing, this affordability crisis and what the affordability crisis in our community is doing to families. People are having to choose between food and rent, or food and childcare, or food and paying their utility bills. And every year, more and more clients. And most recently, I'm on the board of Westside Baby as a volunteer, and we're seeing the same thing there. Westside Baby is an organization that is based in White Center and provides diapers and safety equipment for families in need. And they work with over 140 social service agencies to make sure we're having the most impact on behalf of those families. And we too are seeing a client base that is rising because there are so many gaps that we need to fill on behalf of working families and low-income families in our communities. So all of this volunteer work led me to decide to go to graduate school to get a master's in public education, or a master's in public administration with an emphasis on nonprofit management. And so I got what was a 2-year degree program. Took me 7 years to finish because I started with one child and did while I had 2 and was in the process of adopting a 3rd. And as I know, as a working mom, childcare access, the ability to actually go to school, it's a big deal and it's a challenging thing to do. And I was really proud when I got that degree and I pulled my kid out of class from 2nd grade to make him come watch me walk so that he could see that accomplishment and hopefully be inspired by that the same way that they inspire me. And I wanted to do this because I wanted to take my commitment to community into my professional life. And I was fortunate enough about 8 years ago to be hired by Joe McDermott, a King County council member who represents a lot of the 34th district as the 8th district council member, to be his chief of staff. And then for the past 2 years, I've worked for Dow Constantine as his deputy chief of staff. And it's interesting to look around in these environments because the majority of people in public service are women, whether they're educators or in government. It's women, but not in the leadership in a lot of these areas. And so that is too a motivating factor for me to run. And I'm proud of the work that I've done at King County. I'm proud of work we've done with the Best Starts for Kids levy, the Veterans, Seniors, and Human Services levy, and work that we continue to do for basic infrastructure and a variety of things. And I feel that that professional experience combined with my personal community engagement and my perspective would serve people here in the 34th well. And I really look forward to the opportunity to partner with you and to represent you hopefully in the 34th district. Thank you so much again for being here tonight, and really looking forward to hearing from you all and questions and issues that you're most concerned about and ideas you might have for things that you want to see addressed. So thanks.
What a segue. Question time. I have one here. What we're going to do is we're going to walk around. We've both got a couple of mics. Me and Ty. Ty here with, he's my cohort tonight, representing South College. So you have a question, just raise your hand. We'll come to you with a mic, ask your question, and it'll get answered.
Thank you. Last night, there was an event in my North Elridge neighborhood where an RV slammed into a health club. And it brought to light a number of issues that are being faced throughout the 34th district. And I'm not sure that Seattle is the poster child for addressing those issues, but I'm wondering from, you being a senator at the state level, what can be done to address the core problems that our homeless are facing, the lack of educational opportunities, on-demand drug treatment, things to really address the issues that they're facing other than, just, opening more shelters, which we've seen that's not a solution. So what basic things can you bring to us from the state level to finally start addressing some of these issues that we're facing?
So the other thing about homelessness, first off, is that we can't treat homelessness as a monolith. Folks are homeless for different reasons. For the most part, folks are homeless because they missed a paycheck, they're escaping a domestic violence situation, or they had a crisis that cost them a lot of money that they are no longer to stay in their homes in the first place. So the first thing we need to do is address these things separately. So for instance, the leading cause of family homelessness is actually domestic violence. So most people who are women and children that are homeless are actually fleeing a domestic violence situation. Obviously, that's very different than a person who is experiencing a mental health issue or an opioid issue at the same time. So that's one of the basic things, is that we need to disaggregate how we address homelessness. Interestingly, on the state level, they have what's called the Washington Housing Trust Fund. So essentially money being spent for affordable housing. Well, that budget was slashed during the recession, and they actually haven't brought it back up. So before it was about 20 million, it's about 120 million at this point right now. During that time, we also cut services like mental health and also health and human services. So things that would have kept people in their homes and also created more housing for them as well. So it's interesting because if you look at the way that the states prioritize our funding and then you see the outcomes in terms of homelessness right now, it really shouldn't be a shock for folks to see that there's an increase in homelessness because we are not prioritizing it effectively. That's one of the problems that I see in terms of how we can address it specifically. Although more tangible stuff like you're mentioning, diversion tactics. Pearl Jam actually is doing a good job in terms of funding organizations that support diversion tactics. It's 3 times cheaper to keep somebody housed than it is to take them out of homelessness. And oftentimes it's things like helping them move to the next apartment. In Burien, there's a building called Fox Cove. I'm not sure if folks have heard about it. The people who live there are being displaced. It was bought by a developer in Bellevue, and they gave them notice to leave by the end of October. A lot of these folks have a very real possibility of ending up in homelessness, and it's because they don't have enough money to get to another apartment. Well, first off, finding one in this market, but then also paying for the last months and the deposit as well. So if we did things like had diversion tactics where we just kept people housed, we'd actually be able to stabilize the issue that we're seeing right now. I'm assuming that's the time.
Is
Or it's time for you to wake up.
Probably both.
Thanks for the question. Yes, there are certainly things that the state can do, but I think that it's a great demonstration of both how complex this problem is and how many people need to be stepping forward as partners in solving this problem. It's not something just the state government can solve or just our municipalities can solve. We need to work with nonprofit entities, we need to work with community, and we need to work with private organizations, businesses, all to come together to come up with solutions, because it is unbelievably complex and there are many base things that we could start to do. So at the state level, definitely need to restore the Housing Trust Fund, because that helps us to leverage dollars to build more affordable housing, which helps to prevent people from becoming homeless in the first place. So that is definitely a step that we need to take. At the state level, there's also the document recording fee that helps to fund homeless services. There are some restrictions around that fee. I would like to explore loosening up some of those restrictions, because I think in different municipalities, there are different things that might work. And I want to be able to have municipalities have some opportunity about how they might actually access and use those funds and leverage those funds with other work that they are doing. We absolutely have to address and put more resources into mental health. We were at a forum last night and there was talk about counselors in our schools and how much they are needed in our schools. And we know how many homeless students that we are seeing. And that is a path and a way that counselors can work with families, caseworkers can work with families to find out if they are in danger of becoming homeless as well. At the county, our Best Starts for Kids levy has helped to fund a family, youth, and homelessness prevention program. And that program in 2017 prevented over 3,000 people from becoming homeless. And it did it in a way that provided flexible funding for those caseworkers so that they could work with each family to determine what it was they needed to prevent themselves from being homeless, whether it was rent or a connection with a family member or access to a job resource or a utility bill paid or going into recovery, any number of those things. And I think that the state needs to work at trying to provide more opportunities for that kind of flexible funding for our frontline workers who really see and know what our families are facing. And I think that's a place where the state can step up. Another thing I would like to see the state do, and this is related again to affordable housing, but that they opened up surplus lands that the state has to say, hey, if it can first be used for affordable housing, let's look at that and see if it's a good spot for it. But they left the Washington State Department of Transportation off of that list as an entity that needs to review those, and I would like to understand why they did that, and frankly, I would like to have them on that list so we have more opportunities for affordable housing as well.
Thank you. So I totally forgot why you have 30 seconds flashcard, so I'll sit in front of
We've been
you.
doing this a while.
We'll figure it out.
Hi, my name is Charlie and I live in Highland Park. So over the past year, we've heard several news reports about young people in the area involved in gang activity and having access to guns. I wonder, as Senator for the 34th District, what resources you'll bring to that part of the district and what initiatives you support to prevent people, a lot of them people of color, like myself, Mexican American, who get involved in gang activity. And, you know, we can talk about gun control, but a lot of the guns that these people access are not obtained legally. So what kinds of initiatives and resources will you bring to the district to kind of prevent people from falling into those kinds of situations where they feel compelled to join gangs as opposed to having opportunities to kind of succeed?
Well, I think in your question, you highlighted the most important point, which is that most often people are likely to join a gang for, economic benefit or protection or a sense of community if they're not getting it within the community where they live. And so, absolutely working to put resources into our communities and working with those communities, hearing from communities what it is they need so that they can have the resources to provide opportunities for after-school care, for training, for jobs. Our labor unions are great partners in this work, and we're sitting in a building that has, on a campus that has a lot of opportunities in it. We have a lot of colleges who can, I think, help us to come up with programs and things that we can demonstrate to kids at younger ages. Hey, here's a living wage job that you can get. Here's a path that you can take to get there that is realistic. And I think that more apprenticeship programs, more work on priority hire, community workforce benefit programs actually can help us to open up a lot of those opportunities for jobs for people within their communities, so they can stay in their communities, live and work in their communities, and have that great sense of community engagement. It's another place too where I think making sure that we have caseworkers, even if they're not just mental health workers, but having caseworkers available in our schools who can see where families who may be at risk, and who can identify those things early and have the flexibility and the ability to try to direct families, not just the kids, but the families who are trying to support those kids, toward resources that can also help them to prevent those kids from falling into gang violence. Because you're right, this is an area where responsible gun control is not going to solve the issue of gangs. And we really do need to be looking at better resource opportunities within communities, and how the state can take down barriers they may have inadvertently put up and can help provide more opportunities to connections to programs.
Yeah, so if you look at Burien specifically, at their budget, 1% is spent on human services, so things like after-school programs, support for youth. 53% is spent on law enforcement, so more criminalizing, kind of policing instead. Like you mentioned before, a lot of it is prioritizing how we fund our youth in our community to make sure that it's set up in a way where we're actually going to give the resources necessary to help our kids. There's a whole host of things that should be done and needs to be done. For instance, when I was a kid, I actually went to the Boys and Girls Club in White Center, not too far from here. They had programs after school, they had programs in the summer, they provide food, a lot of kids would come and play and hang out. That is no longer available. So by giving kids an opportunity and a place that's safe to go and to be and exist, I think is an important thing to have for our community, that I think would hopefully alleviate some of those issues as well. But also the opportunity is important. So right now, Washington State, your healthcare, but also your education, really depends on where you live. So we need to make sure that we're actually funding our schools appropriately to address the specific needs for certain areas. So if we wanted to have more equity in, say, for instance, the Highland School District, those resources should be available for that. I actually think it's very important to have representation in this mindset as well. So oftentimes, if you look at the teaching staff at the various schools, they may not necessarily reflect the diversity of the student body themselves. I think we need to have more role models at all levels of the kids' lives to show them that there are positive outlets they can have. So what I would do is help develop a pipeline for teachers of color by giving them grant programs, having the resources to become teachers, so they themselves can be an influence in these kids' lives in the classrooms as well. But yeah, it's a very, very difficult problem to have. I believe that we should work on the prevention. I believe that we should work on restorative justice and making sure that we are engaging these communities in a respectful way.
So I live in West Seattle, and one of the big issues that I face is right now is traffic and sort of getting around, whether it's during rush hour or not during rush hour. What are some of the programs that you could introduce or that are being introduced at the state level that could sort of expand infrastructure, whether that's public transportation, bike trails, sort of bike-specific areas so that it's safer for that, and sort of on the cars side, how can we make that more efficient and or expand it?
Yeah, good question. Both of us actually take public transit quite often, and largely it's because the West Seattle Bridge from like 8 until like 11 is basically just gridlock. One of the things that we can do is supporting intermodal types of transportation, so giving folks different opportunities to get to work. So whether it's the water taxi, whether it's the bus, make sure that the lines are running at specific times. So there's the 56, 57, and there's the C line that goes down as well. The 120 that goes around right here. So working with Metro to make sure that those are being staffed at the appropriate times, which I think they're doing a pretty good job. One of the things too is making sure that we get transit here faster, so ST3. So one of the things that we can do as a community and as a state legislature is work with the regional communities to figure out solutions to how do we get ST3 here faster. So West Seattle is one of the stops along the lines. Right now there's about 5 different options about where it's going to be. A few of the options actually have White Center and Nguyen in mind, so depending on how you orient the terminal of the Sound Transit, you can actually get down to West Seattle, to White Center and Nguyen easier as well. So I'd be a very huge supporter of ST3, making sure that we get the funding for that, making sure that we work with the regions to appropriately implement where it should go, and then work with the communities to figure it out as well.
Thank you. Yes, I too am a transit rider and very much appreciate it. And then I have a lot of friends who bike and bus or just bike, and then of course people who take their cars because based on where they live, transit is either not an option for them, or many of us who have kids have to get our kids throughout different areas of the town, and it can get more challenging to actually just do it with public transportation. So I think at the state level, I mean, certainly making sure we are holding feet to the fire on the light rail, that we continue to push for light rail as quickly as we can get it. There are, of course, just some real physics issues around how quickly we can construct. But I think Sound Transit and Metro are working good in partnership and in partnership with the state to be sure that we have a project here that is going to move forward. I think that we really do need to look at our infrastructure funding and how we can best fund both trails and our roads. We need to figure out better ways to partner with our federal government. We have bridges that are ready to fail, frankly, is how they put it. We do not have enough funding to match our funding with the federal government's funding to fix these things. So it's going to require a big partnership with the federal government as well. We are working on this 509 corridor project. That is actually great. And again, that's a place where the county, the city, everybody worked together to make sure that we could align on the priorities there and be prepared to move forward. And so I would push to be on the transportation committee because I believe for this district that is a particularly important area. You have not only our public transit here, but you have our ferries that serve Vashon and Maury Island as well. And then as we're dealing with the transition to the tunnel, and we also need to make sure that the state is holding up their responsibilities when it comes to mitigation for that work that has been done on the waterfront and for the access that we need from this peninsula, frankly, especially as it is impacted by the change from the viaduct to the tunnel. And so I think being sure that the senator is paying attention to what the state committed to and being certain that we're holding the feet to the fire for the funding for the mitigation for that work as well.
Just for the people behind you.
Yeah, I'm from White Center. I'm 17, so the context is because my question is about the youth. And I know that people who, kids my age, I have so many friends who deal with mental health issues, and really the only way that we see to figure that out is weed, partying, and drinking, and we don't really see anything else, especially because main stressors, usually the number one stressor is what's going on at home, parents, for example. And what I'm trying to ask is, how would you help that problem? Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think it also highlights that we are living in a time where we're seeing a lot more anxiety from our young people in general. We're seeing it starting much younger. And I think it's really important that we are doing what we can to address whether it's trauma or simply understanding how to transition, as life is changing in front of you, right? Because it's highly anxious times, and the access to news sources, to things on the internet, there's a lot more information coming in. So this is why I think it is really important that we make sure we do have more mental health counselors in our schools, that we continue to fund and actually increase our funding for behavioral health. The state did a pretty good job last year of putting more dollars in that, and I think we need to do more of that. I think that it's important to acknowledge that if we can start addressing trauma in kids from 0 to 5, if a child has experienced trauma and you can get them in front of mental health support services, for every dollar you spend doing that, you save $17 in the future for services that they may have to get as an older child or as an adult. So it's not just a benefit because it's the right thing to do for human beings in our communities, it's also an economic benefit that we have a way that we can step up and address these kinds of anxieties on the front end. And I also think in our schools we need to do more educating about what other opportunities there are, why there are things to do other than just party and use drugs in order to address, the stress issues. And if you don't have that family support, we need after-school programs. We need to be funding things for our schools, and we need reliable, consistent funding for our schools, which is why we need tax reform. But we need these things so that we are providing a resource if a family is not an option and a resource. And sometimes families want to be there, but they're having to work 2, 3, 4 jobs just to support their family, pay for their rent, pay for food. And so again, I think this is a place where our education revenue and funding needs to step up.
Very good question. Born in White Center as well. I don't know what your situation is, but at least for me when I was growing up, it was very tough for us because it was always a constant state of survival. I had to work multiple jobs as a kid, I had to take care of my siblings as well. My mom wasn't necessarily around, my dad was in a car accident, so he had to deal with his stuff. So a lot of the trauma that we faced, I think a lot of folks face as well. And you add on the extra layer, so for folks in White Center, you're from a culture that is not necessarily American, but also you're not from where you were from as well. So how do you code switch from being your immigrant refugee self, but also how do you fit into a culture that doesn't necessarily understand how to relate and how to work with you? So part of that anxiety, at least what I felt, was how do I fit in my house, but also how do I fit in this culture as well? So part of that, I think, is making sure, like you mentioned before, is having the opportunities for young kids to do things and see positions of leaders themselves reflected. The White Center CDA has a program called White Center to White House, where they basically take interns. You want? Oh, no, that's a good one. Oh yeah, man, Aaron Garcia is doing a great job over there.
I love him.
Yeah. Sorry, my bad. Got a connection there. So what that program does is it basically gives folks in White Center an opportunity to thrive, but also shows them what it means to be in leadership positions. We have to give our young kids and ourselves an opportunity to succeed. And that's one of the programs that I think is going to be very successful, is because oftentimes when you're from White Center, I was told that I was not good enough, I wouldn't go to the right schools, I didn't have the right background, didn't have the right education, that I would never succeed. And that causes a lot of anxiety. The problem is, if you don't have somebody telling you that you can do it, that those people are wrong and you're actually right, sometimes you fall for it and you believe it yourself as well. So part of it is making sure that we have those resources like the White Center CDA, but it's also making sure that our leaders show up for our kids and let them know that they actually should be in positions of leadership and they are allowed to be successful as well.
I was wondering what your ideal approach and policy would be for helping people who are struggling with intravenous drug problems in the district and the city. If you could have it however you wanted it, what would you do? That makes sense.
You said, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last one.
If you could have any sort of policy or approach to helping people who are struggling with intravenous drug use here, what would you do?
So I actually support safe injection sites. Part of the crisis that we have with opioid addiction is that people are going to use it and they're not doing it necessarily in the safest ways. I actually have a friend that works at a clinic that allows folks to use, and one of the things that he told me about was the fact that a lot of folks that come in, they oftentimes build a relationship with them, and then through that experience, they're able to actually refer them to treatment as well. So the biggest thing for me is to treat these folks like they're human, because they are. And oftentimes the folks who get into this situation in the first place, they got into a car accident, they were prescribed drugs, and then no longer were prescribed drugs, but now they're addicted, so they try to find it somewhere else as well. So first off, acknowledging the humanness of these folks, because these are somebody's moms, dads, brothers, sisters, and people, providing them with the resources that they need in order to get off of it, but doing it in a humane way that acknowledges their humanity. So that's the biggest thing for me. There's a lot that we can do in terms of dealing with the pharmaceutical companies, providing the resources for it, but the biggest thing for me is treating them as humans and providing a safe space for them to consume, so that way hopefully they feel the trust and the bond they can then go and get the help that they need.
Yeah, I think I would be stunned if any of us in this room have not been somehow impacted by the opioid crisis that we're facing. And I absolutely would, in the ideal world, I would support safe injection sites, particularly in places where we are seeing people regularly going and we know that they are using intravenous drugs outside in public and in an unsafe environment, and also, likely sharing needles. I mean, there have been issues with, especially in our homeless communities, about people, contracting HIV or hepatitis, things like that, based on their drug use, and that we want to do everything we can to keep them safe and to keep the rest of the community that they're participating in safe as well. And it really is about making sure you have people there who they can build trust with. So it's not just about having a safe place to use the drugs, it's about having a place where you feel you can trust the people there, where you're more likely to listen and believe them when they say that recovery is an option for you. And then also to remember, oftentimes, especially in the cases of opioid addiction, recovery doesn't work the first time. And so, oftentimes people go into recovery, and then they come back out, and then they fall back into a pattern or fall back into the same community they were spending time with, and they become addicted again. So it's also about remaining committed and knowing that just because somebody might not succeed in recovery the first time, that there needs to be that same opportunity for them over and over, potentially. And having people there, again, and available and trusted, I think, provides the best environment both for their recovery and then for them to rebuild and have lives within the community again.
Thank you. I think it's important that whoever represents us is on the transportation committee. I really see the tunnel as a nightmare, but that's a different issue. Are either of you endorsed by any environmental group? And all the discussions so far have been about social issues, which are important. The environment is also very important.
Yes, and endorsed by the Washington Conservation voters. And I think that environment is vital. Climate change is an issue we have to be addressing, and we have to be addressing it now. I'm very pleased that in this state we have Initiative 1631 on the ballot, the Carbon Fee Initiative. It's an initiative I support. I think it's imperative. And I'm really pleased that for that initiative, communities came together, stakeholders came together, labor, communities that are disproportionately impacted by the impacts of climate change, and then environmental groups as well, and people in the state really did come up with what I believe is a very comprehensive and meaningful and impactful initiative. So I'm very hopeful that it will pass at the ballot, and if it does not, again, at the state senate, I would be wanting to work with the people who have been leading on this issue and leading on this work to be certain that we did something in the legislature to move forward on that. As we all saw this summer, Tahlequah was like a symbol, and seeing what is happening to our orca population is a symbol of how we are failing to address environmental impacts and climate change, and it is a call to action. And there are many things too at the state level. The Puget Sound Partnership Action Agenda, I think comment period may have actually closed recently, but for the next 5 years, that action agenda is out. I think it's 5 years. And making sure that we're looking at those near-term items, how we're investing our dollars. I think we need to potentially reassess where some dollars get spent, because things like stormwater management that are a little less expensive may be more impactful as we're looking at salmon populations and habitat restoration and a variety of other things. So I do think this is an area in particular where the state can really play a big role in partnership, as I said, with our municipalities to be certain that we are all doing the best work we can do, and especially as we've seen, again, this federal government that is stepping back from those responsibilities.
Oh, look at that timing. That's impressive. So we actually have the most endorsements from environmental organizations, and largely I think it's actually because of the lens in which I look at it. So environmental justice is one way to go about talking about the environment. So obviously it's important because climate change is very real and we're being impacted today. But disproportionately, communities of color and low-income communities, specifically ones in this district as well, by the Duwamish, are impacted by it. So when we talk about healthcare issues, oftentimes when you go to areas that are pollution burdened, they have higher rates of things like asthma and other issues as well. So making sure that as we're working towards alleviating issues regarding the environment, we're also doing it in an equitable lens. And that's why I also support 1631, Not just because I think we need to alleviate and penalize the biggest polluters, but by having it done in a way that's more equitable. So oftentimes what happens is the gas refineries will say they need to raise their prices, they will charge more for gas. What 1631 does is it actually provides a fund that helps the burden for folks who would be impacted by that as well. So completely agree that the environment is very important. Obviously we saw a lot of that with the forest fires and with what's happening with orcas in our population here. But we also need to do it in a way where we actually support the working families that are going to be impacted by it right now. So say for instance, we want to get those coal miners and coal workers off of coal. What we can also do is make sure that we provide supplemental income, healthcare benefits, and job training to get them off of that as well. So as we're working towards making sure that we have a more healthy environment, we're also making sure that we're working with the working families and the people who are going to be impacted by it so that they don't necessarily bear the full burden of it at the same time.
So, a little drier, but budget and taxation, obviously all these programs need funding.
Yeah.
What is your strategy for making sure that the budget allows for that and specifically taxation being a part of that?
Yeah. Washington State has literally the most progressive tax structure in the United States. We are one of the wealthiest states in the wealthiest nation in the entire world. There should be no reason why anybody is too poor to live here, right? So one of the things that we support is certainly a capital gains tax. But I'll be honest, I think what we really need is an income tax, just because the way that it's being done right now is not necessarily equitable. However, the important thing to note is that we can't just layer on taxes on top of other taxes. We have to lower property taxes, we have to lower sales taxes, and I actually want to get rid of D&O tax for small and medium-sized businesses. So the idea is that we need to make it a bit more equitable. So families that make under $25,000 a year pay about 17% of their income in taxes. If you make over $500,000 a year, you pay about 2% in taxes. On that tangent, there's about 684 tax exemptions on the books right now for corporations and businesses. What's fascinating is that we're about to vote on Proposition 1, which is a levy. Those expire. Corporate tax breaks, they never expire. So what we can then do is revisit some of those and make sure that they're actually providing the public good that they need as well. If you add up the value of the tax breaks, it's more than the actual budget in itself. Now, if you're there, I think that should be revisited. I'm actually a supporter of the state bank as well. So Washington State sends about $2.3 billion in interest fees to Wall Street every single year. If we can harvest some of those gains by having our own state infrastructure bank, which it actually would help pay for some of the transit stuff, but also we can repurpose those funds for local issues as well. That's a very long-term goal, but it's definitely one of the things that we can look at. But in terms of having a progressive tax structure, it has to be a balance of a lot of things. So I would support more progressive sources like capital gains, like income tax, but I also want to make sure that it's paired with lowering property taxes, lowering sales taxes, lowering B&O. Just because right now seniors are being pushed out of their homes. So oftentimes folks will be able to live in a very nice flat, but they can't afford the property taxes. So, yep.
Yes, we absolutely have the most progressive tax system in the nation. It is on the backs, our sales tax and property tax are on the backs of our working family and our lowest income residents. It's completely upside down. So I support a capital gains tax on wealth, where your primary residence would be exempt, where there would be a cap on the amount for people, who are not getting vast amounts of income and really just out off their stocks and bonds. It's really just about the wealthiest 1% to 2% in our state. And I do believe that that money should actually be used to diminish part of our property and or sales tax so that we can demonstrate and build trust and accountability with taxpayers about really we need it when we're talking about rebalancing. And then I think when we talk about new revenue, there's closing the corporate benefit loopholes. There are, the Washington Budget and Policy Center really highlights about 22 of them that they think could be addressed pretty quickly. And I think there are at least 5 or 6 of those that you could pull out, related to things like luxury services and international banking and investment banking, to really look at those and say, are these giving us the public benefit that was intended? And if not, let's close them and let's use that new revenue for some of these other things that we've been talking about. I absolutely think we need B&O tax reform. I'm concerned about eliminating the B&O taxes as described, just because it's a really broad and dispersed tax. And so I think we need to look at it and talk about having those taxes apply only to only to gross revenue, not to everything that comes in, and talk about how could manage that. And I think we should actually, really be bringing small and medium businesses to the table to see what could be most effective there, because I do think that's a revenue. We don't want to lose all of that revenue base necessarily either. And then I think we need to look at things like our real estate excise tax, which is, there are ways we could expand that. And that's a potential possibly for some more revenue as well.
So hi, so in order to develop the young people future, the education should be improved more, right? So the students should be provided with many resources, such as the programs, activities, classes, everything like that at school. However, nowadays, many schools are not able to afford or create many resources for students. They even cut the classes and close down some programs. So, because they are facing with the financial problems. So if you added everything, what can you do to improve this problem and help the students as well as the school?
Thank you for that question. I think as we were just talking about, it's important to try to get a more consistent and stable revenue source for our schools. And so that will involve some tax reform. And so I think that that's one thing that we need to step up and make sure that we are working on. But in the currently, within the situation that we're in now, the state injected money last year to help solve the McCleary issue, which was a lawsuit saying that we were not meeting the quality public education as our paramount duty. And I think that is certainly helping, and it's good to have that injection of money, but I think we need to take another look at how we are dispersing that money in our schools, what kind of equity lens that we are using based on what they call regionalization around the cost of living around those schools. Education and quality public education is really what compelled me to begin volunteering in my community in the first place, because I saw that for kids who live in neighborhoods with higher income levels and different kind of property values, and so they would get more money for their levies, were the ones who were getting better programming in their schools, the ones whose PTAs could support better programming in their schools. That is inequitable. That is not providing a fair opportunity for everyone. And so I think we absolutely need to address that from an equity lens. And I would like to see the decisions that we are making at the state be certain that they are also using an equity lens, that we say, as we're funding and we're breaking out this funding, it's not just about the cost of living in an area, it's also about what are the opportunities in the different schools that we are seeing, what are the PTA funds like, because so many PTAs make up the difference, and that if you're in a school where a PTA can't do that, is that a school the state really needs to step up and inject more money into so that those programs, can be covered as they should with quality public opportunity and education. So I think we're going to have to continue talking about this as we're continuing to make some adjustments to the McCleary decision.
Yeah, listen.
What's interesting is you mentioned potentially having resources for things like glasses and whatnot. I actually started wearing glasses in the 3rd grade. The only reason why I knew that I needed glasses in the first place was because I went to Hazel Valley Elementary and they actually had optometrists come. We were too poor to actually go to an optometrist, and I just thought that I had normal eyes. I didn't realize they were bad. And it wasn't until those resources came in and showed us that, oh, you actually have poor vision, and here's a way to actually alleviate some of those issues. I don't actually know if that service is still available, but I do know that they've cut funding for things like the Boys and Girls Club and stuff like that as well. Certainly would make sure that we have funding for those issues. Education is very important. We talked about it previously, why we need to have a more progressive revenue stream in order to fund that. We're actually endorsed by the WEA, so the teachers in Washington State. My wife is also a public school teacher in Shorewood, so the Highland School District. I went to Hazel Valley, I went to Cascade Middle School. I completely understand what you mean when the resources aren't necessarily there. So, for instance, for me, I relied on reducing free lunch. So I had free lunch during lunch, but during the morning we'd also have breakfast as well. and oftentimes those are the only meals that we were able to get pretty regularly during the day. So when we talk about equity in our classrooms, like, we need to make sure that we're thinking it in a bigger terms, because literally me being able to get food to get through the day is part of that, which I think gets missed oftentimes. But yes, so in terms of making sure that we fund schools in an equitable way so that the PTA doesn't necessarily have to close that gap, I think is one of the important things, but also just prioritizing how we spend our budget in this state. So if we can pay for corporate tax breaks, if we can pay for things like, you know, luxury goods, we can certainly afford to pay for things for support for our kids.
You talked about the transportation issues and how you would address those and the taxes and things like that. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on development, and because I've seen West Seattle, I've been here for over 20 years and it's gone crazy, and I know a lot of the developers are not necessarily people that you and I would know, that we would be friends with, and I feel like I just want to know what your ideas are about our need for development and getting more housing for people, but also making sure that it's affordable and that it doesn't create more traffic issues, and how we balance all of that and make sure that it's not people coming in from the outside that are buying up things and investing in the community and not being part of the community as well.
Yeah, there's a term called transit-oriented development that we can certainly apply in terms of making sure that we build things in a way where you can partner transit with also the housing. One of the things, you kind of call it out actually, is when we talk about affordable housing, we're also talking about transit, because folks are being gentrified right now and pushed further away. Washington State, or Seattle specifically, has a very interesting stat where generally folks who take public transit have a higher income than folks who don't, which means the folks who are driving are then forced to have to drive because they don't have access to the transit that they need. So certainly very important in terms of making sure that we have an equity lens in terms of that. But I support more density, to be honest, and I support it being done in a way that it's actually a part of the community. So, for instance, the Cielo Gardens, where I was actually born and raised, is mixed income, where they're trying to bring together multiple communities. It was done in a way where it can engage the folks who are there. A few blocks away, there's an apartment building where the Burning Boys used to be. I don't actually know what it's called. But it's huge, and it's not necessarily done in a way that would be mindful of the community as well. So there are certain ways to do things where we have more inclusionary zoning, where we're looking at it where we're seeing that we can then partner with the community to build out more housing and not tearing up our neighborhoods at the same time. But it has to be done in conjunction with transit, because look, that's an issue right now. If you're being pushed further away, but you can't get to your job, you have to drive 2 hours to get to your job, then that becomes a problem as well.
Yeah, thank you. I've seen it, I've only been here just about 20 years, and I've certainly seen the changes. But I think this is a place where the state, through the passage of the Growth Management Act, really has tried to create scenarios for municipalities that will have planned growth. And then we have what's called the Puget Sound Regional Council. There's a Growth Management Policy Council as well. And these are all places, excuse me, and spaces where policymakers gather to try to make these decisions based on where the Growth Management Act says that we can grow inside of an urban growth area. So I think continuing to make sure that we are engaging with all of those entities and that we're getting input from communities about the impacts, the real impacts that these decisions are having is important. I am a big supporter of density at transit-oriented developments. It is vital for families, for individuals needing to get to school, get to work, and it provides opportunity for housing, and it provides opportunity for aging in place for our older populations. My dad lives about a block away from the Capitol Hill Light Rail Station, and his partner can't get around as easily as she used to, and it has let them actually maintain their ability to go downtown and have dinner and to stay in this community that they've really grown to love, and seeing their ability to age in place literally because they just happen to live somewhere where they've been for 35 years and now there's a light rail station there has been remarkable. And so I think the state continuing to be sure that when we are investing in transit-oriented developments, that those developments are living up to the intent, and that they are indeed places that are providing different housing options for families, for individuals, and that is where density can be, so that there is access to that transit. But I think just being sure too, we're just staying to our commitments of the Growth Management Act, and as changes are made or things needed at the municipal level, that communities are really the ones stepping up to talk about what those need to be.
So I had the privilege of traveling to Europe recently. I know a lot of people can't travel, but I went to Paris, and I'm not sure if you're aware, but Paris is the densest city in Europe. It's about 40 square miles, and it has about 2 million people living within those 40 square miles. It was crowded. It was crowded going on the metro. It was hot. It was very stressful. When you talk about density and supporting density, I think that a lot of people don't understand what density means. So having that many people in such a constrained area, and that's about half the size of Seattle roughly, when you're saying density and transit-oriented development, I don't hear you talking about maybe having employment moving to where people live. So what would you do to address that so that people don't have to commute as far? So that if somebody living in Deering, if somebody lives in Deering, they don't have to drive all the way to downtown Seattle just for work.
Yeah, I appreciate that observation, and this is a place where a lot of the times, honestly, like municipalities, and I have to explore the economic development piece more at the state, but where we actually have a lack of resources for planning ahead for economic development usually, because it tends to be seen as sort of an optional thing outside of a lot of the basics. But that is a place where you can talk about economic development and where you can start to make plans as you're doing things within both the community planning, the regional planning, and the state planning to account for wanting to be sure, especially in this changing economy, the ability of people to work closer to home so that we are not having people have to access transit or drive their cars every day to get where they are going. And so again, this is the kinds of conversations that happen at things like the Puget Sound Regional Council, the Growth Management Planning Council, and then at the state level, if you're talking about any changes to the Growth Management Act, I think economic development is a part and parcel to all of that. And I do think when we're talking about density, it's not just the goal of having people use all that transit every single day to get to work. It's that transit provides an opportunity for people either to get to work or downtown to eat dinner or to Burien to go, see a friend or to whatever the case might be. It's actually just about providing access that is not car dependent all of the time. And, but I think your point is well made, that economic development should be a piece that we are talking about, especially in this changing economy, and how can the state provide opportunities for that rather than throw up barriers to that.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I've never been in Paris, but it looks lovely from what I've seen in the movies. So there's certainly a public-private partnership that can be had in terms of how do we develop in a certain way to bring some businesses here. So Expedia's coming over here, Warehouse's over here, to make it a bit more easy for folks who live and work here as well. However, there's kind of a tangential question that I think kind of asks as well, is right now the way that zoning is done in in Seattle specific, is that certain neighborhoods tend to get the short end of the stick when it comes to density and upzoning, specifically in South Seattle, because supposedly the land is a lot cheaper. I think if we're able to actually disperse where we do this, where we do density and disperse in terms of where the burden potentially is as well, I think is also important as well, just to make sure that it's done in a way where it's not necessarily just concentrated in one spot.
How could you guys help the issue of gentrification? Especially if you've been in White Center recently, Yeah, it's been really messed up recently.
Can't find parking. It's the weirdest thing. Oh, is it?
Yes, sir.
So there's a few things. If a minority-owned business moves, there's very little possibility that they come back. If communities of color move, there's very little possibility of them coming back. So when we talk about gentrification, we're talking like forever because it's hard to bring folks back. Oftentimes, what we're talking about here is making sure that we have affordable housing, making sure that we have the social services in place so that folks can actually stay here. And that's why I think Green Bridge and Cielo Gardens are pretty cool, is because they have mixed income housing so that folks are able to actually afford to live here, but also be part of the Darden community as well. The hard part is that gentrification is happening and it's going to happen. I grew up in White Center, and I've never had to deal with parking before on that strip on Amron 16th, and now it's like, holy crap, you can't find anywhere to park. And a lot of that is because the neighborhood is changing, the dynamics are changing. So in terms of gentrification specific, I think we need to have more programs and services for minority-owned businesses and communities of color to hopefully make sure that they're able to stay. Everything from like exemptions for certain property taxes for senior citizens, but also having provisions for minority-owned businesses as well. And also the schools. We talked about this extensively, but making sure that the schools are funded in a way that's equitable.
Yeah, that's a super challenging issue in this region in particular, as we've seen, again, the economy shift so much and so much more wealth pour into this community that makes everything and the cost of living so much more expensive. So I think first and foremost, it's addressing issues of housing affordability and keeping people from being displaced from their communities. And so I think it's making sure that we do have, and this is, more municipalities than the state really, but the state can put in parameters around inclusionary zoning that requires certain kinds of, in developments, if there's a certain number of family units, a certain number of low-income units, so that we're not just building for, two people to live in a dwelling, but that we actually can create spaces for families where we can really build some community and have actual engagement. And then I think it's about making sure we've done some of this work, again, at the county through the Veterans, Seniors, and Human Services Levy, where you're going into communities and saying, okay, what is causing you to potentially have to leave? What can we do to help provide either resources, whether it's funding to upgrade a business to make sure that it's more energy efficient. There are many things that can cause a business to have to be displaced, and I think there are many ways that our governments and our nonprofits can work together to try to prevent those things from happening. And so going into community and actually getting that information, understanding best how to address a particular issue in particular communities, like White Center, like many of our South King County neighborhoods, I think is vital to actually having the state then know where to focus funding so that we can be most effective.
Hi. So I have another question about traffic stuff. So on more controversial subjects, so we have congestion, tolling, and then toll-only roads, and bus-only lanes. I was wondering where you guys stand on those kinds of things, because it seems that sometimes the rest of the state gets angry about those things and they don't like them, whereas a lot of us know the need for that.
Yeah, we subsidize the rest of the state, that's right.
Yeah, I support tolling, and I think I've liked the way it's been instituted thus far, where they sort of do a try, they set a rate, they anticipate what they think it will mean to have for the impacts on the other roadways, and then they potentially adjust depending on the impact that it's having. But I think we've got, as I mentioned earlier, we have failing infrastructure. We have to support it. And so that is one of the ways that we can do that. I am definitely a supporter of bus-only lanes in the spaces and places where they are appropriate. And I think, again, it's an area where sometimes, thankfully, it's paint, right? So you can try it out and see how it goes. And if for some reason it doesn't work, I mean, there's a cost involved, but it's not a huge infrastructure cost. And so there are ways, again, to navigate, to work with the planners. In our case here, it's mostly, working with Metro and with Sound Transit to partner and see, okay, where does this make the most sense? And how should we best do this? And how does it affect the flow of traffic? And then reassessing after a period of time to see if it's working, to see if there are any changes that need to be made. But I think the reality of the congestion here make it vital that we provide those opportunities so that our transit system works the most efficiently that it can, and then also to be certain that we're able to support our infrastructure.
Yeah, I actually support tolling as well. However, bringing it back to something I talked about earlier, the folks who use transit tend to be wealthier, and the lower income folks tend to be driving more, which would be disproportionately impacting them as well. So although I support tolling, I'd also look at some solutions to be able to hopefully offset some of those costs for them as well. Whether it's having subsidized tolling costs by having a specific sticker, depending on your income level and whatnot, I think it's important to make sure that we're doing it in an equitable way. Certainly support the bus-only lanes. I think those are fantastic to have. And also, in terms of infrastructure costs, that's why I also support a state bank. So Washington State does have debt limits that we need to abide by as well, and make sure that we're able to provide the resources to fix these things sooner rather than later. I think a state bank would actually help as well.
So I agree with a lot of what has been said tonight, but after November, one of y'all is gonna have to go to Olympia, and you're gonna have to deal with folks that are on the eastern side of the state that don't necessarily agree with your point of view. So what leadership skills do you have that you'll be able to bring with you to Olympia to work with folks on the eastern side of the state to get some of your ideas implemented?
It's totally going to be my question. Thanks, Pete.
Yeah, perfect. No, you're absolutely right. What's interesting, I actually believe that there are more things in common that we have that separate us. So, in terms of healthcare for all, they may not necessarily believe in the implementation. In terms of progressive tax reform, they may not necessarily believe in the implementation. But we certainly want what's best for our community. So I think that there are common grounds that we can work towards to make sure that we're doing this in a way that's inclusive. However, I'm going to throw out a caveat. So this district, the 34th Legislative District, is one of the most liberal and left-leaning in the United States. The precinct that voted the most against Trump is actually in this district, in Vashon Island, in the entire nation. So one of our responsibilities as a person who represents this area is to make sure that we're able to be bold in our leadership as well. So in terms of, say for instance, the capital gains tax, we lost that by maybe a couple of votes. The responsibility of a person that's here is to hopefully ensure that the voices of the folks in the community and the people are actually understanding what's at stake as well. So we're very lucky that hopefully in November we'll see a very good blue wave where the Democrats will actually have a majority in the Senate, in the House, and also the governor's office, potentially a supermajority as well. So we can actually make very bold, progressive changes right now. So in my mind, yes, it is important to work across the aisle, and I will work with anybody who wants to. However, my focus is on the people and making sure that we stand for working families. And that's going to be kind of the things where I care about the most. So healthcare for all, like I don't really want to compromise on that because I've seen what happens when folks experience healthcare crisis. Progressive tax reform, I've seen seniors being pushed out of their homes and not being able to stay where they live. So I get that we should be working across the aisle. We also live in a district that is incredibly liberal, where it's safe. I can say things like the income tax, and people won't tar and feather me, like they actually applaud sometimes. So it's important for the person here to make sure that they're bold in their leadership as well. I've ran teams of 50 to 100 people. Student vice president, stuff like that in the community. There you go.
Yes, I mean, working at the state level with a variety of people who bring their own personal perspectives as well as the perspectives of the constituencies they represent is a very different animal than working within the 34th district. And it's not just even across the aisle. It's oftentimes people who are Democrats, but just because of the area they represent, they may approach an issue differently than I would approach it as the state senator from the 34th, right? As representing this very liberal, very progressive area. And so I've had the experience of the past 8 years of working at King County, where we have a King County Council that has Republicans and Democrats on it. There are currently 3 Republicans and 6 Democrats. When I started there were 5 Democrats and 4 Republicans, all representing different geographic areas of the county. And sometimes the issues are between the Republicans and Democrats, but oftentimes it's Democrats arguing with each other around what is best and most important for the area that they represent or what their personal philosophy is on a particular issue. And so I have had a great deal of experience working on really progressive things, like the Best Starts for Kids levy that really does fund and work on especially 0 to 5 issues, but also frankly up to 25, where we're talking about diversion and where to put resources and how to impact families and kids at the earliest stage possible so that they have an opportunity to succeed when they are entering school and when they are going through the K through 12 education process. And that, believe it or not, was controversial when we first started talking about it, right? And it requires bringing all these stakeholders in. It requires talking to those different elected officials to see what they're interested in, to see what their communities are talking to them about. Where should those dollars go? People get pet projects. There's any number of ways that people throw up hurdles. And I've had a great deal of experience working and actually moving legislation through that kind of body.
Lots of good questions, thank you.
New ones too.
Yeah.
Not long ago, there was a thing that happened at the state level regarding the Freedom of Information Act. Everybody there was like, what a fabulous idea, let's do it, quite excited. And for a lot of folks, that was kind of alarming, a little distressful. Maybe you could just share a couple words on what you thought about that, how it all played out, and how you would address it in the future as our elected official.
Well, I think it's very clear they screwed up on that one, and it's really the transparency of our government is key to having people trust our government. And the state legislature passed the Public Records Act, and they imposed it on all the other municipalities, but not on themselves. This was way back when they first did this, and so this was in some ways a clumsy attempt to fix that, but they were trying to exempt themselves from pieces of it, which I don't agree with at all. Again, working at the county, I work under all of the public disclosure request responsibilities. It is occasionally burdensome when you have somebody do, there are people who make requests of some pretty vast things, but for the most part, you can really hone in, contact that person, see what their intent is, what they're really interested in. We have attorneys who work on the issues around privacy and being certain that, we're not in any way revealing things, for example, for a constituent or something that could be dangerous to them, things like that. And so I do think in this case, the state really did drop the ball. It's clear they did. Most of them have opened up and said they did. And I think it's not unreasonable at all to expect our state legislature to live up to the transparency and accountability that we should live up to.
Yeah, one of the hardest parts about passing, I think, progressive tax reform or whatnot is making sure that you're holding yourself accountable. Right now, there's not a high level of trust in our elected officials across the nation, and by doing that, certainly erodes it as well. So that was obviously very, very wrong, and they should hold themselves to a different standard than everybody else. But the biggest thing is trust within the community, and how do we build that? And that's certainly an error that they had and should not have done in last session.
Anybody else?
No,
Thinking about it?
good.
Do we do a cheer now too?
Yeah.
Almost.
all right.
Almost. How about we do closing comments? Shannon, let's say 3 minutes. You want to start?
Sure. Thank you again, everybody, for being here this evening. I really do. It's such a privilege to be in the 34th District, to be a part of this community, and to run for this seat. And you see in front of you two people that are very different from a lot of the people that are in our elected bodies. This system was not set up to support a single working mom with kids being able to serve in the state Senate, right? I mean, you see in front of you two people that are different than what we often expect from our elected what we often see from the people who are able to run for office. So it's a particular privilege to be able to run. I really appreciate that community engaging in this way and really being democracy in action, as I said earlier. And I do believe that my personal experience, my experience within this community, my understanding of what it means around things like access to childcare, access to health care, our education system, how climate change impacts our working families, is a good perspective to bring on behalf of the 34th, and that I would be a great partner with you as your state senator in the 34th 4th District. So I appreciate your consideration. Again, I appreciate you being here tonight. And if you have any other questions for me, I'm happy to answer them personally after this, or you can certainly go to my website and send me an email. Accessibility to your candidates and to your electeds, I think, is really important. And so I will always be available and accessible to you to hear your ideas and your concerns. And so thank you again for being here, and I'll look forward hopefully to seeing all of you again soon.
Yeah, to echo that, thank you so much for coming out. I know that it's difficult to come out on a weeknight for something like this, so we appreciate the support. Again, we're very lucky in the 34th to have great leadership and great people running for office, so I'm very fortunate to be able to run and to be considered for this seat as well. Again, born and raised in this area, very proud of what I'm seeing in terms of the folks who are here, and I want to make sure that we have that at all levels of government as well. Again, this community really was the one that helped raise me. It really gave me a voice, and that's why I want to serve, is because I think we need to have that voice for all communities in this district serving. I'm the first person of color to win a primary in this district, potentially the first person of color to serve in the House or the Senate. It's 2018. I was proud when I first started saying that, and now I'm kind of sad because it's too long. We need to make sure that we have representation that reflects the diversity and the breadth of this community. And my goal is to represent everybody in the 34th to make sure that we have the access and opportunity that we need as well. Again, thank you so much for hosting. I really appreciate it. And I'll be back here answering questions if folks have any as well. Although you've just answered questions for an hour and a half, so there's probably not too many more questions unless there's personal